Okay, so now we're going to be talking about Plato's Republic. Again, we're using the Allen Greek philosophy textbook. And in your book, you only have book 4 of the Republic page. We're starting on page 197. Again, I really encourage you to read the entire Republic. We do have an ancient philosophy class where we read the entirety. Perhaps you would like to go ahead and pick it up now and start reading it. I'm just going to be hitting the high points here. We don't really have the time to cover the entire Republic. Perhaps that could be another video series. The premise of the Republic is that Socrates and his dialogue partners are looking for what justice is. And as the conversation goes along, there are several competing theories of justice that are rejected. Finally, they decide in order to figure out what justice is in the individual soul, we're going to find out what justice would be like in an imaginary city. And this imaginary city becomes this sort of scaffold around which to discuss the idea of justice. The city starts out rather small with only a handful of people. And as the city expands and people desire more luxury goods, the city gets more and more complex. And it's divided into the 3 classes that you see on the slide here. Each class in the city represents a different part of the soul. So let me just walk you through this chart here so you can see what I've done with it. We're actually going to start out on the right-hand side. Plato and or Socrates, we can't always distinguish between Plato and Socrates, suggest that a city can only be just when it is ruled by philosophers, perhaps selfishly, because Plato is, of course, a philosopher, but also because only philosophers are capable of understanding what justice is. They're capable of seeing the forms, the ideas. And since only philosophers are capable of understanding what justice is, they're going to have to be put in charge of the city. There are quite a lot of rules and regulations in the city governing the arts and poetry. Only those ideas that are conducive to the tranquility, the harmony of the city are going to allow to be expressed. So the philosopher kings are going to set up a regime of censorship. For example, they will not be allowed to depict the gods fighting with each other. The gods are going to have to be shown in harmony with each other so that it inspires the citizens of the Republic to act in harmonious ways with each other. Certain types of music are also censored. The philosopher kings are not going to allow music, for example, that's too discordant. We want only martial, harmonious, courageous types of music that are going to inspire the citizens. Another form of censorship or regulation in the Republic is of sexual conduct. So the you could say this is a form of eugenics. The philosopher kings are going to decide who's allowed to mate with who's allowed to have babies and who's not allowed to have babies. So we want to have a good breeding stock for the Republic. So this is the top layer in the city, the guardians. It says guardians 1. As the dialogue begins, we really only have 2 classes, the guardians and the producers. But gradually they split into these 3 groups. At the head, at the top, the guardians, representing the rational element, the mind, the intellect. They're at the top of the city. There's another division of guardians who are the auxiliaries, who are both soldiers and administrators. So we need some people to go onto the front lines and fight. But we're also going to need some people, presumably, doing regular government work, I suppose. So there's really 2 groups of guardians. So the the philosopher kings, the faculty that they correspond to is the rational element. And the virtue that they need to have is wisdom, so that they can understand what the forms are, so that they can understand what justice is, and apply that to the governance of the city. At this second layer, the guardians represent the spirited aspect, the emotional life. And their virtue is courage. This is one of the preeminent Greek virtues. It almost doesn't matter what ancient Greek writer you read, they all emphasize courage. We have to remember that the Greeks were always going to war with each other. And so they really value courage. They were also always worried about perhaps the Persians coming along and flattening everything. So they had to be courageous in order to survive the Persian threat. So they really valued this virtue of courage. And of course, we're also kind of moving down the axis of the body. So we start out with the head, then we move to the heart, and then we move down to the hands and the feet. Okay, well now we move down to our lowly producers. These are our potato farmers, our artisans, and basically everyone else who makes the city run. The producers don't, in a sense, they don't really have a virtue of their own. Their virtue is moderation or temperance, which is actually shared with the city as an entirety. Within their own group, their goal is to just not let the appetites get out of control. We can't have our farmers, our merchants, and so forth drinking too much. We can't have them having too much sex. Of course, we know their sex life is going to be regulated. So they have to have moderation to hold these appetites in check. This column here correlates these three levels to another dialogue, the Phaedrus. So in the Phaedrus, there's the myth of the chariot. The charioteer represents the intellect. Okay, this charioteer has two unruly and winged horses. Okay, the charioteer's job is to keep the chariot going upward towards the life of the soul, away from the life of the flesh, and towards the realm of the forms, towards the eternal. Okay, so the charioteer is battling these two unruly horses. One unruly horse is the emotional aspect. The other unruly horse is the appetitive aspect. Okay, so it's not to say that the emotional life and the life of the appetites are bad per se. It's just that they need to be led upward towards the ascent that we talked about last time in the diotoma speech. Okay, so this might sound a little bit complicated at first, but all of this entire chart, on one level we can read it as a political theory. We could read it as an actual plan for a city, but we can also read it as an ethical theory. Okay, that the ethical life happens when all three of these layers are functioning together harmoniously. Okay, and this actually has its precedent in Pythagorean philosophy. Pythagoras taught a very similar idea. In fact, some Pythagoreans accused Plato of plagiarism because the Pythagoreans had this similar idea of harmonia, that the good life, the happy life, comes from a harmonious interaction of the parts of the soul. So politically, in a political sense, justice happens when each part of the city sticks to its own affairs and doesn't meddle in the affairs of the other parts of the city on a political level, right? So the philosopher kings, their job is to rule the city. They don't try to tell the potato farmers how to farm potatoes. The soldiers, it's their job to guard the city, to make war. They don't get to pass laws. The producers, it's their job to just stick to their trades, do what they're good at. Okay. Now, there's a few more things about how the city is set up. The the guardians are, both of these layers of guardians are not going to be allowed to own private property. They live in a barracks. They they do everything communally, including the rearing of children. Um, they're they are not wealthy at all, and Plato put this rule into place in order to keep them from being greedy, to protect the city from bribery and things like that. So the wealthiest people are actually the producers. Okay. In fact, commerce is going to have very few regulations at all. Commerce is going to be, they're going to be allowed to make their own contracts for commerce. So commerce is one of the few things in the city that's not heavily regulated. So the Republic has inspired all kinds of political philosophies on the right and the left, and you can perhaps see why that's the case. There is some movement between, you get the sense that there is some movement between the classes. So perhaps if one of these producers is really good at farming potatoes, he's going to be moved up to become a soldier. And perhaps if one of these soldiers has a philosophical bent, he's going to become one of the philosopher kings. Okay, so there's a kind of tripartite division of soul, which when we get to Aristotle, we're going to see that he also had a threefold division of the soul. And you can talk about, well, are they similar? Are they dissimilar? Right? Before we go on, I just want to read a few parts from book 4. So if you will turn to your to book 4 at 435. It's page 197 in the Allen book. It says, now we decided a society was just when each of the 3 types of human character it contained performed its own function. And again, it was temperate and brave and wise by virtue of certain other affections and states of mind of those same types. Accordingly, my friend, if we are justified in attributing those same virtues to the individual, we shall expect to find that the individual soul contains the same 3 elements, and that they are affected in the same way as the corresponding types in the society. 3 types of soul, 3 types of person in society. Okay, and I'm just going to skip along. All right, to this is at 441. I'm sorry, the Allen doesn't have the paragraphs numbered. It just has it doesn't have the A, B, C, D, E. Okay, so it's in the section that Allen labels as the virtues in the individual on page 203 in the Allen book at the bottom. This applies to justice. We shall conclude that a man is just in the same way that a state was just. And we have surely not forgotten that justice in the state meant that each of the 3 orders in it was doing its own proper work. So that we may henceforth bear in mind that each of us likewise will be a just person, fulfilling his proper function, only if the several parts of our nature fulfill theirs. So just briefly skipping on through here, brave in the spirited part of his nature, temperate by reason of the unanimity and concord of all 3. Okay, so we can say that justice is each part of his nature, each part of the soul's nature exercising its own particular function, and we can say that justice is a kind of well-tempered harmony. Okay, so that's book 4. I just want to skip over to the allegory of the cave. This is a diagram that you can find on the internet. I'm sorry if you can't really read the print all that well. The allegory of the cave is Plato's. Whenever Plato gets in trouble, whenever he's having trouble explaining something, he tells a story, and this is the story that he tells about the cave. And this is going to correspond to the divided line. maybe I can put up a handout of the divided line so that you can see how the divided line correlates to the allegory of the cave. But I'll add that in later. All right. So for book, this is in book 6 when we begin to, or excuse me, book 7 when we talk about the allegory of the cave, but you'll see also how it's correlated to the divided line. So we have here down in the cave our prisoners who are chained up in a row down here, and they're chained in such a way that they can't even look left or right. All they can do is stare over here at the wall. Behind them, there's a passageway, a steep and rocky ascent into the light. So this steep and rocky ascent goes up to daylight. Behind our prisoners, there's a walkway, and there's a wall here. And behind the walkway, there's a fire. The jailers are going to walk along this walkway, and they hold up various different shapes. Perhaps one of our jailers holds up a cardboard cutout of a dog. Another one holds up a tree. Another one holds up a bird, okay, for example. Now, when the guy who's holding up the cardboard cutout of the dog, when he walks past, he actually makes a dog sound. So he says, "Arf," right? And when the guy who's holding the bird cutout walks by, he goes, "Tweet, tweet, tweet." Okay. So remember, these guys, all they can do is look at the shadows on the wall. They can't see behind themselves. So where are they going to think that the dog sound comes from? Well, they're going to think it comes from the shadow, right? And because they spend their whole lives down here in the cave, they're going to need a way to keep themselves entertained. So they're going to come up with games among themselves having to do with the shadows on the wall. So one person's going to say, "Oh, I think the dog is going to come next. Oh, I think the tree is going to come next." And they're going to come up with rewards and honors amongst themselves to see who can be the best shadow guesser, to see who can provide the best commentary on the shadows on the wall. Plato goes on to say, or the character Socrates says, now let's imagine that one of these prisoners is able to escape. And this prisoner makes his way up the steep and rocky ascent to the world of the sun. He goes out of the cave entirely. Now, because he's spent his whole life in the cave, he's going to be blinded at first. He's not going to be able to see at all. So perhaps first he goes out at night. And then he goes and sticks to the shadowy places, right? He looks down in the reflection in a puddle. Okay. And gradually in this manner, he's able to accustom his eyes to the light. And he can finally see the real world as we know it. Now, think to yourself for a second. What is our freed prisoner going to think about these poor suckers who are still stuck down in the cave? I hope you're saying, well, he's going to feel sorry for them, right? He's going to feel bad for them because he's going to see how beautiful the real world is. And he's going to want to let them in on the secret. So he's going to climb back down into the cave and try to free those prisoners and let them go. Now, what do you think would happen if he goes back down and tries to tell them? So take a look at 517, or just before 517, and continuing for the first part of 517 on page 226 in the Allen book. Now imagine what would happen if he went down again to take his former seat in the cave. Coming suddenly out of the sunlight, his eyes would be filled with darkness. He might be required once more to deliver his opinion on those shadows, in competition with the prisoners who had never been released, while his eyesight was still dim and unsteady, and it might take some time to become used to the darkness. They would laugh at him and say that he had gone up only to come back with his sight ruined. it was worth no one's while even to attempt the ascent. If they could lay hands on the man who was trying to set them free and lead them up, they would kill him. So, who is this guy who goes up out of the cave, sees the light of day, and then goes back down into the cave to try to tell the other prisoners that they are living in basically a false world? Well, of course, this represents Socrates, or just the philosopher in general. So as Plato is writing this, he knows what happens to someone who tells people that the values that people hold to be dear are basically bankrupt. Remember that Socrates had been telling the Athenians that they were focusing too much on wealth, too much on glory, too much on fame, and they weren't paying enough attention to the virtues of the soul: truth, justice, beauty, and goodness. So the philosopher goes back down into the cave, and of course he's set upon and killed. So this is an allegory. Everything in an allegory represents something. Okay. So uh, these prisoners are the people who are living the unexamined life, the people who haven't been exposed to philosophy. The fire is basically the light of the sun. In a curious kind of inversion, what we think of as the real world, the life of the senses, for Plato is not the real world at all. Okay, the real world is the world of the ideas, or the world of the forms, which are accessible only through philosophy. The steep and rocky ascent is the philosophical life, the life of dialectic, of the kinds of conversations that you guys have been reading about in your book, of contestation, of debate, and through that process of constant contestation and debate, being able to find out the meaning of ethical terms like truth and justice and goodness and beauty. So this whole story is basically about the life of philosophy. Okay, that's it for this video, and I believe we're done with Plato for now, and perhaps I'll post some other things later.